The night I believed my family was complete, I stood in the kitchen listening to my daughter laugh down the hallway, and I remember thinking that nothing truly terrible ever announces itself. If disaster ever came for us, I was certain it would arrive from outside our walls, not wearing a familiar voice, not carrying my name. I am a man who built his life deliberately, not with grand ambition but with patience, repetition, and care, the kind of care that leaves little room for chaos. I worked for decades in a profession that rewarded restraint, saved without obsession, loved without spectacle, and married a woman who understood that stability is not the absence of passion but the quiet decision to stay. Our home reflected that philosophy, not large enough to impress strangers and not small enough to feel temporary, filled with furniture chosen for comfort rather than trend and memories layered so thick that even silence felt inhabited. When people asked me what I valued most, I always answered without hesitation that it was the sense of continuity, the feeling that what we had built would outlast us in the form of a single, extraordinary child. Alena was our only daughter, the axis around which our lives turned without ever feeling off balance. She was not loud or rebellious or demanding, she was observant, articulate, and unusually composed for someone her age, and that composure made others trust her instinctively. Teachers praised her judgment, relatives deferred to her opinions, friends leaned on her during moments of uncertainty, and my wife and I watched with a pride that never cuddled into anxiety because Alena never gave us a reason to worry. She called regularly even after moving back home for what she described as a temporary pause between opportunities. She cooked dinner on evenings when my wife's energy faltered, and she spoke to us with a respect that felt genuine rather than performative. Those early months of her return felt like a gift we had not expected to receive again. I had assumed, as most parents do, that adulthood would carry her away from us in stages that felt both necessary and painful, but instead she seemed to fold herself back into our rhythm with an ease that reassured me we had done something right. She knew when to speak and when to let silence sit, when to offer help and when to step aside, and she possessed a talent for smoothing tension without drawing attention to the effort. When my wife struggled with fatigue that lingered longer than either of us wanted to admit, Alena adjusted without complaint, quietly taking on tasks and responsibilities while insisting that it was nothing, that she wanted to be useful, that this was what family did. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because her behavior aligned perfectly with every story I told myself about who she was and who we were as parents. I had no interest in questioning harmony when it presented itself so convincingly. Even when Alena began asking more thoughtful questions about our long-term plans, our finances, and the practical realities of aging, I had concern rather than calculation. She framed those conversations gently, often late in the evening when the house had settled, speaking about the future as something we would navigate together, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and gratitude that she was willing to engage with realities many families avoid until crisis forces the issue. My wife, always more emotionally perceptive than I, commented once that Alena had become very serious lately, but she said it without alarm, more as an observation than a warning. We attributed it to maturity, to the natural shift that occurs when a child begins to see her parents not as constants but as people subject to time. When Alena offered to help organize documents, appointments, and household matters, we accepted without hesitation, grateful for her initiative and touched by her sense of responsibility. There was no moment that felt like a surrender, no single decision that registered as consequential, only a gradual easing into a dynamic that felt collaborative rather than corrective. Our days took on a predictable shape that comforted me deeply. Mornings were quiet, afternoons punctuated by small routines, evenings marked by shared meals and unhurried conversations that wandered through memories, current events, and Alena's plans for the future. She spoke of possibilities without urgency, of paths she was considering rather than destinations she was chasing, and that lack of desperation reassured me that she was grounded. She listened attentively when my wife spoke about her fears regarding health and independence, responding with empathy that felt sincere, offering reassurance without dismissing the underlying concerns. I noticed, without attaching significance to it, that Alena often positioned herself as an intermediary when extended family or friends reached out, fielding calls, clarifying misunderstandings, and explaining absences. She had always been good at communication, and I assumed she was simply protecting my wife from unnecessary stress. When invitations became less frequent, I told myself that people drift apart naturally, that life becomes insular as responsibilities multiply, and that our contentment did not require constant external validation. Alena seemed to understand that instinctively, often reminding us that peace was more valuable than popularity, that a smaller circle was a stronger one. There were moments when I watched her interact with others and felt a quiet awe at her composure, the way she could mirror what people needed without appearing insincere. She never raised her voice, never appeared flustered, and never revealed more than she intended, qualities I had once cultivated in myself and recognized as both strengths and shields. If I ever felt a flicker of unease, it dissolved under the weight of familiarity and affection, because how could I distrust someone whose childhood scraped knees I had cleaned, whose nightmares I had soothed, whose future I had imagined with such clarity? On evenings when my wife went to bed early, Alena and I would sit in the living room, the television muted, talking about nothing in particular, and I remember thinking that this was what success looked like, not accolades or wealth but continuity, the sense that what mattered most had endured. She asked me about my work, about decisions I had made decades earlier, about regrets I might have carried, and I answered honestly, unaware that my openness felt like an investment rather than a conversation. I told her that the greatest relief of my life was knowing that she would be there when we needed her, and she smiled in a way that felt warm, reassuring, and entirely unremarkable. If there were cracks forming beneath that surface, they were invisible to me, not because I was careless but because everything I saw reinforced the narrative I had lived by for years. Families falter through neglect, through cruelty, through absence, and we had been none of those things. We were attentive, generous, and present, and our daughter appeared to reflect those values back to us with interest. There was no tension in the air, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations to signal that something was amiss, only the steady hum of a life that felt complete. That is what makes the memory so difficult to hold now, the certainty with which I believe that love, when carefully tended, could not be turned against itself, that the greatest dangers were always obvious and external. I did not know then that trust can be reshaped quietly, that intention can be repurposed without changing its tone, or that a family can be dismantled not through conflict but through compliance. At that moment, standing in the kitchen, listening to my daughter's voice move through the house like something permanent, I believed with absolute conviction that everything that mattered was safe, and that belief was the foundation upon which the rest of our story would be built.